consciousness can manifest any disease and even death. Is there a science behind the process of manifestation? I'm your host, Bruce Lipton, for this series on inner evolution. The revelation of the DNA double helix in the genetic code in 1953 led to the belief that the character of our health is primarily encoded in our genome. This misperception leads people with chronic diseases to believe that they are victims of their heredity. Up to 90% of all disease is now attributed to stress, not dysfunctional genes. This session will describe the role of emotions and symptoms as feedback information, the role of the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, in undermining health, and the power of the placebo and nocebo effects in shaping health and happiness. Let's begin to understand how thought shapes the character of our machine-like body. In previous episodes, I've used the model of a simple machine to help us understand how biology works. There are 4 components of that machine. There's the mechanism, which represents the gears that carry out the function. The proteins in the body are the equivalent of that mechanism because the proteins create the functions. In addition, there is a force that drives the gears. And we now find out that the force that drives the gears is when environmental signals combined with proteins, this engages the proteins to create their function. The third element is the switch. This is a very important element because it's the switch that controls the action of the machine. In a living organism, the switch is the equivalent of the nervous system. And in our study of cells, we found that the cell membrane, the skin of the cell, represents the cell's brain and nervous system, and that through connecting environmental signals to the proteins in the cell, the membrane is controlling the function of what we experience in cell biology. The last part, and not the least, is actually the gauges, the feedback. And I say, well, the gauges give us information on how the machine is operating. To give you a simple understanding, consider the gauges on the dashboard of your car and the significance of these gauges. When you look at the gauges, you get an understanding of how the vehicle is performing. Well, guess what? These gauges tell us about the operation of the machine, the vehicle. Well, the body, as we talked about, is the equivalent of a vehicle as well. Now, we have gauges, but our gauges are much more easy to understand. Our gauges are actually a sensation, feelings, emotions. These are the gauges that inform us about how our body is operating. The gauges actually represent functions of the human body when we understand them. For example, there's a pressure gauge, and the pressure gauge is really reflecting the same kind of pressure that we have in our body. So stress is a representation of pressure. The more stress, the more pressure you're putting on the system. The second gauge actually is the temperature gauge. Well, temperature in the human body is connected to anger, because as you start to get angry, your body temperature starts to build up. And we get angrier and angrier, and all of a sudden you overheat the system. Just as the same thing would happen if you're driving your car and watching the temperature gauge go into the red. The last gauge is the battery gauge. In our connection with the human body, the battery gauge relates to our relationship to love and fear. Love is empowering our energy, like empowering the battery. In contrast, fear disempowers our energy. We lose our energy, and so love and fear actually represent whether we're charging our biology or actually using up our energy. So the question is this: well, what do the gauges represent? Again, emotions and symptoms. Anger is an emotion. If you're driving your car and you see the temperature gauge go up into the red, you would obviously say, well, I better pull over and let this thing cool down so I don't overheat the engine. Well, you know what? When we get angry, if we had a gauge, what we would also notice is that we are also building up a lot of heat in the system. Well, actually, the same thing applies to us. If we start to build up too much anger, the most important safety measure at this point would be to stop and cool off, because if we really push that anger, we'll overheat the system and cause damage to our physical body. So, anger is one of those emotions, and we should recognize it as not just some side effect of our biology, but as feedback on the operation of how we are using our biology. And the same thing applies to pressure. How much stress are we under? If you start to see the pressure gauge go up too high, it could blow a gasket. Well, guess what? If you start to get under too much stress, your biological vehicle could also blow a gasket. So these are not just side effects of being in a body. These are actually the body talking back to you. And we should pay as much attention to the emotions in our body as we actually do to the gauges on our dashboard. Symptoms are the equivalent of gauges, and there are some very fundamental symptoms such as fever, a swelling that occurs if you damage some part of your body, or pain. The information coming from the body to tell you about the performance of your biological vehicle. And there's an unfortunate situation because when we start to feel a lot of discomfort, medical doctors actually like to alleviate our pain by giving us medications and drugs to remove the experience of these negative symptoms, these negative feelings that we're experiencing. And I say, well, you know what? That is throwing a monkey wrench into a fine-tuned machine. When you take a drug and cover up the symptoms, it would be the same as taking masking tape and covering up the gauges on your dashboard. Yep, I don't have to pay attention to the gauges, but there's a problem with that. Obviously, the gauges were informing you about the vehicle's operation. And if you cover up the gauges, you don't understand what's going on. You ignore what's going on. And as a result, you can actually cause greater damage to biology. These symptoms, such as fever, are actually the result of 1 million years of evolution. And the significance is this: a fever is not to punish you. A fever is the body's recognition that you have an infection and that this infection is temperature sensitive. And why it's important to raise your body temperature is that it will kill these infective organisms. If you have a fever, one of the most important things to do is actually wrap yourself up in a blanket and help the body increase the temperature, because that is what the mechanism was all about. That mechanism was to kill the infective agent. Somewhere up to about 105-degree temperature, that's in the normal range. If you go above 105, then you might need some kind of intervention to help you with the problem. But up to 105, support the body, allow the fever to occur. It will immediately at that point stop the infection. But if you interfere with that fever, you will prolong the infection. Another symptom that we interfere with is swelling. Well, it doesn't look pretty, you don't like the looks of it, so we put ice on swelling, and that will bring the swelling down. I say, was the swelling a problem? I go, no. Again, swelling was a result of 1 million years of evolution. What does swelling represent? It represents the fact that the biology is actually increasing the fluid in the tissue where the damage occurred. When you've broken cells, you cause tissue damage and trauma, and the fluid that's pumped in that causes swelling is actually used to wash out the damaged material. And so swelling is actually an effort to help heal the body. And therefore, if you start to put ice on a swelling, you're interfering with the body's mechanism of self-healing. So again, it's a symptom that is actually expressing a healing response. And lastly, pain. When we hurt ourselves and then we have trouble walking, let's say, there's a tendency to take a pain reliever so I don't have to feel the side effects of the pain. And yet, the pain wasn't there to punish you. The pain was there as important information in regard to how you operate your body. Basically, it says not to use that part of the body at this time. Like a gauge on the dashboard, that this part is now under repair, and by continuing to use this part, because you've covered up the pain, you're actually again interfering with the healing of the body. So, in understanding the nature of emotions and symptoms, recognize they're your body's cells talking to you, the operator of the vehicle, to give you information on the performance and what is necessary to maintain health in the system. Well, in addition to symptoms and emotion, the body can break down and start to manifest what we refer to as a disease. And I say, well, what can cause a disease? As we described earlier, life represents proteins plus signals, which cause the proteins to engage in a behavior. But if the behavior is not operating correctly, we refer to this as a problem and refer to it as a dis-ease, that something is wrong with the system. Either the signal or the protein is the cause of the problem. And I say, yeah, either of those sources can create a disease. So I say, okay, can the protein be defective? Of course the protein could be defective, especially if the genetics programming that protein are not creating a functional protein. If there's an alteration in the blueprint, the DNA, it will cause a defect in the protein, and therefore that protein won't operate according to normal function. And that dysfunction of the protein actually can lead to a disease. But it's important to understand this. How much of disease is actually connected to defects in our proteins or defects in our genetics that are producing that protein? And the answer is simply this. Between birth defects and random mutations, less than 10% of disease is actually connected to a defect in the protein mechanisms in our body. And actually, many people believe less than 1% of disease is due to defective proteins. So, for example, let's say proteins are responsible for 10% of disease, then we're left with what is responsible for the remaining 90% of disease? Well, there's only one thing left in the equation, and that is the signal. And I say, well, how can a signal create a disease? I say, well, if you alter or distort the signal between the nervous system and the target cells and proteins in those cells, then you're going to interfere with the behavior of that cell. So I said, well, what can alter a signal? Well, number one, trauma. If I, let's say, fall down and wrench my back, what will that do? Well, it will cause an interference on the information traveling from my nervous system to my body. That interference will alter the signal, and so trauma can be a cause of a disease. In addition to trauma, toxins in the system can interfere with the signaling process and cause the disease, because toxins in the system can distort the signal between the source in the nervous system and the target cells where that signal is destined to go. However, the biggest single issue in causing a disease is not trauma or toxins, it is thought. And thought, what does that mean? Well, what if I misinterpret the environment and send an inappropriate signal to my body to adjust it to my misinterpretation? Well, now the body will be out of harmony with the environment. That is the primary cause of a disease, where our consciousness is misinterpreting environmental signals and as a result engaging inappropriate behavior. So I look at these three sources of disease: trauma, toxin, and thought. And guess what they represent? Well, trauma represents a physical stress. Toxin represents a chemical stress. And thought is an emotional stress when it's incorrect. So all of a sudden I start to recognize the important part, that it is these stresses that are responsible for the health issues that we face in this world. In fact, the American Psychological Association has recognized that up to 90% of all doctor visits are for stress-related ailments. Now, there are two kinds of stress that we have to consider here. One type of stress is called eustress. The other type of stress is called distress. What's the difference? Well, eustress is good stress. You go, stress that's good? What could that be? And the answer is this. If you're exercising, playing a sport, you're pushing on the system to perform. And this effort actually causes a stress on the system. Because as you are pushing on the system in playing a sport or exercising, you're actually causing the system to build up its strength. And so this kind of stress enhances the health of the body and the strength of the system. So eustress, sports, hiking, swimming, whatever it may be, is a good stress. The problems come from distress. And distress, what does it represent? Well, it represents any interference that gets in the way of pursuing your destination, pursuing your wishes and desires. Anything that interferes with that destination or that desire can be cataloged as being a stress.